Week 10 of the fantasy football season, and his top 36 wide receivers. I'm ranking this week number 1, Stefan Diggs of the Buffalo Bills. So Stefan Diggs, he's been a top producer once again in fantasy football, one of the best wide receivers in the league. And to have a great quarterback like Josh Allen obviously always helps, where consistent targets and consistent points and touchdowns put up. And this week here versus a mediocre Broncos secondary, I got Diggs having a big game. Number 2, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. So the last 3 games, CeeDee Lamb's been a man on a mission, and he's putting up huge numbers. Last week coming off a monster 191-yard receiving game. And a lot of people question Lamb that he wasn't a true number 1 wide receiver, but the last 3 weeks, he's gone out there and he proved a lot of people wrong, and he's definitely quieted the haters. So this week here in a great matchup versus the New York Giants, I think CeeDee Lamb once again goes over 100 yards in this one and has a monster game. Number 3, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. So St. Brown still an underrated wide receiver, in my opinion, in the league. On the season, he's had some monster games already under his belt. This Lion offense is a well-oiled machine with a lot of speed and a lot of great playmakers. Laporta, St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs. And this week here in a potential shootout indoors at the Los Angeles Chargers. A secondary that I know is pretty solid, but still you could pass on them and put up big yards with his route running ability and playmaking skills. Amon-Ra St. Brown, I have it 3. Number 4, Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers staying in the same game. So Keenan Allen, it's been a steady season for him. I know a couple times he's missed out on huge games where him and Herbert just missing on big plays, but had a solid performance on Monday Night Football with Keenan Allen versus a tough New York Jet defense, where he went in there, he made some plays, and he took some big hits as well as Keenan Allen. So this week here versus the lightest secondary of the Lions, and like I said, a potential shootout. This could be one of the bigger games for Keenan Allen that he's had in a while. Number 5, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Jamar Chase banged up, not 100%. We saw him take a bad landing in that game last week versus the Buffalo Bills on his back and shoulder, but I think he's going to tough it out. Is Jamar Chase and play in this game. And this is a big game, believe it or not. The Bengals are 5-3, and the Texans are creeping 4-4 on the season. So right now, this is a big game for both these teams. Even at not 100%, we know he's better than still 85-90% of the receivers with his route running ability, the rapport with Joe Burrow, obviously playing with him since college, and just his breakaway speed on the secondary. So this week versus young Houston secondary, even at, let's say, 70-75%, I think Jamar Chase could go out there and put up numbers. Number 6, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. I know Olave might be a little bit high on this list this week here, but a lot of 4 teams on bye, some decent receivers obviously not playing this week here. And Chris Olave last week finally found the end zone after having a dry spell for many weeks. So this week, a good matchup with the Minnesota Vikings. We know their secondary isn't all that good for this Minnesota Viking team. We saw the Atlanta Falcons offense, which really has been stagnant all season. Even though I know Taylor Heineke came in with the quarterback change, go up and down on the field on them. So I think Chris Olave and Derek Carr, they're starting to get things going over the last few weeks. And then a potential shootout at Minnesota. I got Olave at 6. Number 7, Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers. So Adam Thielen, he's top 5 in receptions and top 10 in fantasy points at the position this season. And this week here, a great matchup on Thursday Night Football with the Chicago Bears, who have one of the worst secondaries in all the league. So Bryce Young and Adam Thielen have great chemistry. Pretty much no one else on this team, maybe Chuba Hubbard if you want to say, are really doing anything offensively for this Carolina Panther team. So in this game, a team he's familiar with, playing all those seasons with the Minnesota Vikings and seeing the Bears twice this season. I think Adam Thielen once again has a good game and bounces back after a bad performance last week. Number 8, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. So Garrett Wilson, he did put up 15 fantasy points in PPR leagues last week versus the Los Angeles Chargers. And this week here, a pretty decent matchup at the Vegas Raiders, even though I know their defense has been playing better of late. But Garrett Wilson, we know, is a talented wide receiver, and he would be even a better wide receiver, obviously, with Aaron Rodgers if he didn't get hurt tearing the Achilles in week 1. So this week here might be a little bit high at number 8, but he's starting to get more targets his way. Wilson force-feeding him, and there was a few plays on the sidelines where that ball just wasn't in the right spot, or Wilson would have had even a bigger game, possibly with 25 fantasy points. So this week here at a Vegas secondary where you can make plays on them, even though I know Zach Wilson, one of the worst quarterbacks in the league. Garrett Wilson, I still think, puts on a good performance. Number 9, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Mike Evans, he's having a steady season and more consistency than he did last year with Baker Mayfield, believe it or not, than with Tom Brady last year. So Mike Evans last week got stopped at the 1 yard line, or he would have had even a bigger ball game finding the touchdown. We know he's a playmaker, and this Tennessee secondary just isn't that good versus wide receivers. We saw last week Deontay Johnson do them in, and I think once again Mike Evans has a good game and does them in a big game for Tampa Bay at home. Number 10, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So Michael Pittman, he's been a solid wide receiver, even with Gardner Minshew at quarterback now over the last month of the season. And this week here, good matchup versus the New England Patriots in Germany, where their secondary's banged up. They had to go out there and be desperate to trade for J.C. Jackson with rookie Gonzalez and Matt Judon out for a while. We know Gonzalez out for the season. And Pittman and Minshew have the good rapport, and Josh Downs possibly might not play in this game, where more targets will come Pittman's way, where obviously he's the number one target easily on this offense. They don't get much production from the tight end, and if Downs is out, Alec Pierce will be the number 2 wide receiver. So I think Pittman, just on targets and force feeding him, will be a top 10 receiver. Number 11, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So it was good to see Higgins go over 100 yards, and with Jamar Chase not being 100% and possibly being a decoy a little bit in this game if he does play, T. Higgins, once again, I think, is in for a big target share. I think he's getting it going as Higgins, and it's a contract season as well, where he knows now in the next 6-7 weeks of the regular season he's got to get things going if he wants to get the big payday in the offseason. So this week here versus Houston secondary, young and up and coming, but still beatable, where we saw last week Tampa Bay go up and down the field versus them. I think Higgins has a good game. Number 12, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. So Brandon Ayuk, easily the number 1 wide receiver over there for this 49er team, in my opinion. Deebo Samuel most likely coming back after missing the last few games with the ribs and some other injuries. And Ayuk, he's a great route runner. Him and Brock Purdy have a great rapport. And Brock Purdy, he just always makes his reads, and Ayuk's the guy he's looking at, and George Kittle pretty much in this offense. So this week here versus Jacksonville defense in Jacksonville, where I know they're a ball-hawking team and lead the league in turnovers caused, I still think Ayuk puts up big numbers, and it's a big game for the San Francisco 49er team. 13, Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Johnson's been off IR now for 2 weeks, and last week a nice game, 7 catches, 90 yards, and he found the end zone. Deontay Johnson on Thursday Night Football versus the Tennessee Titans. So this week the Green Bay Packers come to town. I know their secondary is a pretty decent one, but I think Johnson, with his route running ability and his rapport with Kenny Pickett, where Pickett definitely likes Deontay Johnson more, getting him the football to George Pickens. I think Johnson, once again, is a good option and a solid fringe number 1, number 2 wide receiver, definitely for your fantasy team. 14, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. It's his former team here. For DJ Moore, lacing him up versus your former team, you know you want to go out there and prove them wrong, why they traded you or why they released you. So we know obviously Moore got traded to the Panthers for draft picks, and so far Moore's had a good season, even though the last 3 weeks the numbers have dropped with Beckett at quarterback. Is the limit here for DJ Moore versus his former team, and obviously one of the worst teams in the league. Number 15, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So Terry McLaurin, he's carving out another decent season. We know he's a big threat down the field. One of the most underrated wide receivers in the league. I mention this pretty much every week. And he's got a quarterback that actually could stand in the pocket, make the throws, and get that ball down the field with Sam Howell. So this week here, at a good secondary of the Seahawks, but a young one, and a team that does take some chances for the big hits, or obviously a big pick six or something. I think McLaurin could exploit this defense a little bit and have a solid game as a number 2 receiver for fantasy owners. 16, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. And Nico Collins, he's their number 1 wide receiver for this Houston Texan team. And CJ Stroud, he's like a 10-year vet over there for this Houston Texan team. He's getting everyone involved. We saw Collins last week find the end zone. Tank Dell, very impressive rookie. He could run routes, burn a secondary with his speed. And even Noah Brown as well getting in the mix. So the football's been spread around over the last few weeks. I know it's a tougher matchup at Cincinnati, and it's not Tampa Bay, but Nico Collins, like I said, most weeks he's putting up fantasy points. And this week, once again, I think he has a decent game at Cincinnati. 17, DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans. So the last 2 weeks, well, Will Levis in the lineup, and Levis going to remain the starting quarterback, it looks like, for the remainder of the season. Hopkins, he's found found it once again, where Levis, he could throw that deep ball. He's got a rifle of an arm where he fits that ball into tight windows. And him and Hopkins so far have a good rapport. We saw Hopkins a few weeks ago versus the Falcons, where he went off for 4 catches, 128 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And then last week, 10 fantasy points in PPR league. So this week he had a Tampa team that just got torched last week by C.J. Stroud and that Texan offense. I think Hopkins once again has a good game. Number 18, DK Metcalf, the Seattle Seahawks. I know DK Metcalf, he's struggling mightily this season, where his ceiling's pretty much been 10, 13 fantasy points. I know he's not been 100%. I know last week was a blowout game. He only had 1 catch, 50 yards. But this week versus secondary of the Commanders, that I don't think could stop him. I think Metcalf could get back on track, could go out there and make some plays, and they need him to as the Seahawks team. I know they're 5-3 on the season, is Seattle, but DK Metcalf is a player that they got to get back on track right now, and they need him if they really want to win some big games. Number 19, Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Christian Kirk, he's pretty much been the number 1 option, it seems like, over there for this Jaguar team. Calvin Ridley's been inconsistent. Kirk obviously has more chemistry and more time played with Trevor Lawrence, signing as a free agent last offseason. So right now, I know it's a tougher matchup versus San Francisco, but to be honest, this 49er team really hasn't caused a lot of turnovers over the last few weeks. And Christian Kirk, we know, is a speedster, and he's familiar with San Francisco as well, playing all those seasons with Arizona and playing the 49ers twice a season. Number 20, Davante Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. So Davante Adams, his season is taking a bad turn after having that monster game early in the year versus the Pittsburgh Steelers on that Sunday night, where he went for over 40 fantasy points. We really haven't seen much from Adams ever since. And this week here, tough matchup versus the New York Jets. Sauce Gardner, one of the premium corners in the league, most likely going to be on Adams for a majority of the ball game. And right here, Davante Adams, I don't know if he wants out of Vegas or a guy quitting, but for whatever the case, it just looks like a shell of himself, dropping passes. I know him and Garoppolo have missed as well, but now with the rookie Aiden O'Connell in there and a tough matchup versus the New York Jets, I don't really see Adams doing much once again. I know last week a little bit better, but only 7.40 fantasy points he had in PPR league. So this week with a tougher matchup, and weekly the numbers not looking good. At best, I have him as a number 2 wide receiver for fantasy owners. 21, Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. So there's been some pop games here in his rookie year for Tank Dell. And then there's some games where he hasn't shown up and he's only scored 4 or 5 fantasy points. But that's obviously going to happen with a young offense and a rookie quarterback in C.J. Stroud. But Tank Dell had his coming out party last week, going over 100 yards. And this Houston Texan offense showed how explosive they could be. So this week here, I don't think this offense is going to put up those crazy numbers like they did last week, but this could be a potential shootout at the Cincinnati Bengals. And this is a big game in the AFC, because if Houston could pull off the upset in this one, both of these teams are 5-4. So Tank Dell, he's getting better each week running his routes. We know he's a speedster and a guy that could burn pretty much any secondary. And this week, once again, I think he's a decent number 2 option for fantasy owners. 22, Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. So Deebo Samuel, he's been banged up in and out of the lineup once again on and off all season. And that's just been the problem with Deebo. We know he's an explosive wide receiver. We know he played some running back as well when they needed him. And this week here at Jacksonville, at best, I could see him maybe scoring 10, 15 fantasy points is Deebo Samuel. Because like I said, he's taking a back seat to Brandon Ayuk and George Kittle, and obviously Christian McCaffrey being the number 1 man in that offense. 23, Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So staying in the same game. This game here, I think it's going to be a grinded out type of matchup between these two teams. Mid-teens, maybe lower 20s. I know both offenses have a lot of weapons, but Calvin Ridley, for the most part this season, has been up and down. I know he was suspended all last season, and he's trying to find himself maybe once again. And obviously with a new team getting traded from Atlanta to the Jaguars at the trade deadline last year. So Calvin Ridley, we've seen some games out of him. The talent's still there, the speed's still there. And maybe after this bye week, he's well rested and he could get back on track, because we know he's got top 10 potential at the wide receiver position. We saw it for many seasons over there in Atlanta, and he just has to get his legs back, and maybe this bye week clears things up and Calvin Ridley could get things going. 24, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. So Jordan Addison, we know the numbers are going to take a hit, obviously, with Kirk Cousins out for the season with a torn Achilles. But Joshua Dobbs, he looked pretty decent in last week's game, coming in and winning that one after Hall went out early. So Joshua Dobbs going to start in this game. I know it's a tougher matchup versus the Saints where Marshawn Lattimore most likely will be on Jordan Addison in this game. But Addison is a good route runner, 7 touchdowns already in his rookie season. And he's the number one option because I don't know when Justin Jefferson is going to come back. So this Viking team's been playing good football. And Joshua Dobbs, he's hungry and he wants to make a name for himself in this league. So I think in this one, Jordan Addison is a guy he's going to force feed a little bit. We know Addison's got that breakaway speed and playmaker ability. And this week here is a number 2 option still for fantasy owners as a receiver. I think he could be productive. 25, Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. So Amari Cooper last week, 5 catches, 139 yards and a touchdown, got back on track. But this week, a very tough matchup at the Baltimore Ravens, one of the better defenses in the league. And we know this Raven team shut down offenses over the last few weeks. They shut down Detroit in week 7 coming in. And then week 9, they shut down that Seahawk offense to only 3 points. So this week here, Cooper, I think he still could go in there and have a decent game in Baltimore. But like I've mentioned in other videos, Amari Cooper, he's been a player throughout his career, going back with the Raiders and the Cowboys, where in big road games or even division road games, he disappears and puts in a stinker. So hopefully that's not the case this week, but it wouldn't be surprising to me if that does happen as well. 26, Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. At Tyler Lockett this season, the numbers have definitely been down. And I know each and every season when you look at the stats, he is a 1,000-yard wide receiver. So it wouldn't be surprising to me that Lockett just breaks out of nowhere in this one. And let's say he has a 150-yard and 2 touchdown game. That wouldn't be surprising. But also, it wouldn't be surprising to me as well if the Seahawk team runs the football a lot in this game. It gets back to the basics with Kenneth Walker, like they did early in the season, where he was having monster games and they were winning these games with Geno Smith being a game manager for the most part. So this week here, Lockett, I think it could go either way. This Commander secondary is leaky and isn't all that great. And this Seahawk team, they're finally home after it seems like they've been on the road for a while for the majority of the season. 27, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So we don't know if London's going to play 100% in this game. But with Taylor Heineke in the lineup, it definitely bumps him up a little bit. Desmond Ridder, he was one of the worst quarterbacks in the league, holding on to the football a lot, taking hits, and just looking to run too much as well. So this week here, it's a good matchup at Arizona, where their secondary isn't 100%. This could be a potential shootout between these two teams with Kyler Murray coming back, and we know he's a huge upgrade over Clayton Tune from last week, even though Joshua Dobbs, I thought, played well. But anyway, Drake London, we know he's a big play wide receiver, and he just hasn't had a quarterback so far in his young career to go out there and show his true potential. So hopefully him and Heineke could get on the same page if he plays in this one and plays well. 28, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So last week he put in a stinker, 2 catches, 16 yards was Chris Godwin. Well, we know he's one of the better route runners in the league. We know he's a great possession receiver and has great hands. And this week here versus Tennessee secondary, that's vulnerable versus wide receivers, where they're a good team versus the run, but you could pass on this team. And we've seen wide receivers this season have monster games versus Tennessee secondary. So this week here, I think Chris Godwin could get back on track. And him and Baker Mayfield have been building the rapport, except last week, like I said, at the bad game, 29, Jahan Dotson of the Washington Commanders. So the last 2 weeks after Dotson looked like he wasn't going to do anything for owners this season, he's bounced back in a big way and put up big numbers. So this week at Seattle, it's going to be a game where I don't see this Commander team running the football effectively, where they're going to have to throw it up 30, 35 times. And we know Sam Howell's a gunslinger. We know he's a gamer. And we know he's been a solid quarterback this season. So this week here, Dotson, the last couple weeks, for a guy who's not cracked the top 36, is now within the top 30. And I think, once again, carves out a decent game, even if Curtis Samuel plays in this game. 30, Cortland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. So Sutton quietly having a solid season for this Denver Bronco team. It's pretty much a touchdown every other game has been the pattern for Cortland Sutton. So this Bronco team coming off a bye. Week 8, they had a great victory versus the Kansas City Chiefs. And now it's a tough matchup with Buffalo Bills, but their defense is banged up with a lot of injuries. Milano, Daquan Jones out for the season, Tre'Davious White. And if they are trailing early in this one, you know they're going to have to throw the football. And like I said, Cortland Sutton, he's a wide receiver that could run all the routes. Just injuries have held them back over the last few seasons. And this week, once again, is a flex option or a number 3 receiver in 3 receiver leagues. I think he could deliver. 31, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Ever since Deontay Johnson got back into the lineup, the numbers have taken a huge hit for George Pickens. Last week, he failed to even score 2 fantasy points. I know he had a catch in the end zone, but only had 1 foot in. And this week here, I think he could take advantage a little bit of this Packers secondary. But like I said, now with Johnson back in the lineup, pretty much Kenny Pickett is just looking Deontay Johnson's way. George Pickens, he's been a touchdown-dependent wide receiver for the most part. His big playability and his acrobatics of catching the football as well. He's still a guy that cracks the top 36 this week. 32, Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders. So Jacoby Myers, another touchdown-dependent wide receiver as well we've seen out of Myers. Myers, we know, is a pretty solid route runner. He had a decent career with the Patriots the last few seasons before signing on with the Raiders. But everyone on this offense, besides Josh Jacobs, in my opinion, takes a hit with Aiden O'Connell at quarterback. Even though I know Jimmy Garoppolo was a turnover machine, he was a quarterback that still got the football in places for Jacoby Myers to make plays. For whatever reason, Adams and Garoppolo weren't on the same page with Myers, and Garoppolo had a good rapport. But anyway, with a tough matchup versus the New York Jets, one of the better defenses in the league, and a rookie quarterback in O'Connell, who I see having trouble moving the football down the field. Myers is 32, 33, Hollywood Brown of the Arizona Cardinals. So now with Kyler Murray back in the lineup, Brown's numbers should skyrocket. And it's a good matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons, where we've seen over the last few weeks wide receivers go off. We saw Hopkins 2 weeks ago, 128 yards and 3 touchdowns. And last week, we saw Jordan Addison in the second half of that game get things going as well. So this week here, I'm going to pump the brakes a little bit on Hollywood Brown. We got to see if Kyler Murray looks pretty good, where he can move in the pocket, make some plays, and get receivers open on broken plays as well. And Hollywood Brown, the last few weeks, the numbers have dropped off. The first 4 or 5 weeks of the season, he was playing great. But the last 3 or 4, pretty much he hasn't done much. 34, Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos. So a lot of trade rumors. There were Jerry Jeudy, but it didn't come to fruition at the trade deadline. And now he remains with the Broncos. And this week here, matchup with Buffalo, where I think this team's going to have to throw the football a whole lot, especially if they're trailing early and often, is this Bronco team. So Jerry Jeudy, we know he's a talented wide receiver in college, but injuries have been a problem, and he just hasn't performed really this season. I know the last 2 weeks, after that whole Steve Smith fiasco on the sidelines and stuff, with Steve Smith calling him out for the most part, Jerry Jeudy's focused a little bit more. And this Bronco team, after starting off 1-5, they've wrote the ship a little bit, especially beating the Kansas City Chiefs. But anyway, this week at Buffalo, I got him at 34, 35, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So Zay Flowers coming out of the gate the first 2-3 weeks of the season, we thought we were going to see the next breakout wide receiver, but the last few weeks he's definitely dropped off are the numbers here for Zay Flowers. And this team's gone back to the basics, running the football a lot and feeding Mark Andrews, and rightfully so. This game plan's worked for this Baltimore Raven team, where Mark Andrews has been the vocal point in the passing game, and you're running the football well with Gus Edwards, Lamar Jackson obviously getting his rushing yards, and now Keaton Mitchell, a new wrinkle added to the offense, a speedster in the backfield. So right now, Zay Flowers, tough matchup versus the Browns. Denzel Ward, I'm thinking, will be on him for a decent amount of the game. And like I said, the last few weeks, the numbers have dropped off on Flowers, and the 36th and final wide receiver I'm rankings, Demario Douglas of the New England Patriots. So Douglas, he's been a gadget type of wide receiver. They use them in different ways, is this Patriot team. And obviously now with Kendrick Moore now for the season, they need more playmakers and more speed on the field. And Demario Douglas definitely brings that for fantasy owners. So the last few weeks, his numbers have gone up. The snaps have gone up as well. And this week in Germany, in a decent matchup versus a beatable secondary of the Indianapolis Colts, I think he could be a decent wide receiver. So that's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking here for Week 10 of the fantasy football season.